Hello everybody, my name is Steve Marchant and this is my wood shop. Today is the continuation of last week's video, how to use the table saw. This is part 2 and we're going to be going through the rip fence, making rip cuts, the mitre gauge, using cross cuts and doing mitre cuts as well. And also we'll touch on the difference between end grain, face grain and things like that. Okay, let's get to it. Alrighty, so this contraption here is called the rip fence. Table saws will either have a rip fence that comes out to about here that's only fixed in one place, and like this one, a lot of table saws come with a full length rip fence that's fixed at both ends. I recommend getting a full length rip fence because they're far more stable, they're more likely to be parallel once it's been adjusted. And it will keep its parallelity. All table saws will have a lever at the front end or a twisting knob to tighten it down, and what it does, it slides the width of the table saw whilst maintaining its parallelity to the table saw blade. So let's raise that blade up and I'll show you a bit more detail. So the blade is perfectly perpendicular to the front of the table saw, and the rip fence sits perfectly alongside of it. So whenever you're ripping a board down, and I'll explain more about ripping in a second, whenever you're ripping a board down, you keep one edge of the board against the rip fence, and that ensures that you get a perfectly parallel cut, and the board isn't doing that or that. And here is that same thing again from a different angle. So this is as you'd be looking at the table saw running wood through it. So the blade in the middle, perpendicular to the front of the table saw, and the rip fence will sit flush alongside of that. So say if you want it right about that width, you'd run the piece of wood through the table saw whilst keeping it tight against the rip fence, and the blade will then reference the straight edge of your rip fence. Now, all a rip cut is a cut that goes along the length of a piece of wood. So you'll notice there's a grain pattern here, and all the lines are going down, and that's the direction that the tree grows in. And typically when you make a rip cut, you'll use a smaller toothed blade, which means that there are a lot less teeth on the blade, so they'll be further spaced apart. Okay, so here is a real life demonstration for you. So as you can see, I've got the push sticks at ready. I'm keeping the wood firmly pressed onto the side of the rip fence and just slowly feeding the wood through, making sure it doesn't catch on anything, and at the same time keep my fingers away from the blade. So I'm using the push stick initially to keep pressure applied to the fence, and then once my hand is no longer useful, I'll use the other push stick to push it closer to the blade and then through to cut to the end of it. Okay, and let's try that again. So as you can see, I'm using the push stick straight away just to keep the wood up against the rip fence. You can see a knot from one of the boards that's popped out, is bouncing on the top of the table there. So there's the other push stick coming in, just to push it through. I don't want my hands anywhere near that spinning blade, don't want to lose any fingers. And there we are. And as you push it through, you want to reach around and past the blade, keeping your hand away from it at all times. Okie dokie, and the next type of cut that you can make on a table saw is called a cross cut. And all that is instead of going down the length of the wood, following the grain, you cut across the grain. So you just cut the board in half. Cross cut, going across the grain, rip cut, you're ripping along the grain. Okay, let's demonstrate it for you. Now the first very important safety precaution to take with using the crosscut gauge, mitre gauge, is that you never ever use it with a rip fence. And the reason for that is, if you're, say you've measured out a width and you want to make multiple cuts, and you think, yeah great, we'll just put it up against the rip fence and then make the same cut. The only problem with that is the wood, once it's been cut here, will get trapped in between the rip fence and the blade, cause it to bind and cause kickback. So we're going to get rid of that now. And it's very simple. Well, you can either use it with this clamp or you don't have to. I'm going to take mine off so it's easier to see. And very simple. It's got a runner along the bottom of it, which slots into the inverted runner here on the table saw, and that keeps it parallel to the blade. So we slot that in, and you've got to make sure that I've made this mistake a few times actually. You've got to make sure that your crosscut fence is away from your blade, otherwise it will just chop it off and it will be silly. So you measure out where you want to make your cut on your piece of wood. Whilst your saw is off, you push it up against the blade and make sure the blade is in line with your line or wherever you want to cut it. Keep a firm grip on the wood, and then when you turn the saw blade on, make sure you keep your hands away from the blade at all times. Wear your ear protection, wear your eye protection, your dust mask, and keeping a firm pressure down and towards the fence. Gently push the crosscut sled into the saw, and that will make a cut. So here's what it looks like in real life. Again, here you'll notice that I'm reaching around with my hand far away from the blade to take it away from the spinning blade, just so it doesn't get caught in there and flung back. So what you can do to make sure your cut is square every time is when your blade is raised and your saw is off, obviously, you bring your mitre gauge up to the blade there, and you grab a carpenter's square, put that up against the fence, and you can check for squareness that way. And I've just noticed that mine isn't actually a square, so we can undo this adjustment knob, press that against the blade, these do have little dials on the end here, little markings that you can align it to square, but sometimes they're not accurate. I'd like to use a square just so I know I've got a perfect reference to reference it from. And the third very important cut that you'll probably need to do on a table saw at some point is a mitre cut. If you have a mitre saw, perfect, you use that instead. It's quicker and easier. Some people think that the table saw is more accurate. They're probably right. I prefer using a mitre saw. Like I said, it's quicker and easier. So we'll get the table saw set up for a mitre cut and I'll show you how it's done. So here we are. We're back again with the mitre gauge, which is good for crosscuts. It's also good for cutting mitres, hence the name. And all you have to do, the only difference is you adjust the angle to whatever angle you need it cut at. I'm just going to put it at 45 degrees. And again, if you want to make sure it's a perfect 45-degree angle, you can use a square. So we put that up against the blade, bring that like that, and we tighten it down. And would you look at that, it's perfectly on the 45-degree mark. So there's no right or wrong way, you know, which way you turn the mitre gauge. I prefer doing it this way because if I tilted it the other way, then the wood would be going this direction and I'd have to bring the gauge way off the table for the wood to reach past the blade. So I'll do it this way. Again, if you've got a line, if you're just chopping the end off, and it doesn't matter about the sizing, that's fine. If you've got a line, match the saw blade up to the mark. Right, get the ear defenders on, make sure I'm safe, and we'll do the cut. Okay, so firm grip on the wood there. Please believe me when I say that my hand is nowhere near as close to the blade as it looks. That's a trick of the camera. And that's that. A perfect 45-degree angle on the table saw mitre gauge. And that is all of the very basics of using a table saw. We've covered the rip cut, cross cut, mitre cut. We've covered the rip fence, the mitre gauge. Last week's video was the basics of how it works. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Give it a like if you did, give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel so you never miss a video. Visit my Facebook page at Stephen Marchant's Woodshop. You can see all the little things I'm doing in the meantime. And I will see you next Monday for another woodworking how-to video. And it's time for just one last thing. I'm getting a cup of coffee. Bye bye.